On April 16, 2025, an African president was almost murdered, and the killers were hiding just across the border in the Ivory Coast. But why would Ivory Coast betray its neighbor and shelter assassins? Let's find out. The night of April 16, 2025, almost changed the future of Burkina Faso forever. President Ibrahim Traoré, the young and fearless leader who had dared to stand against foreign control, was the target of a detailed assassination plan. It was not a simple plot by angry soldiers or criminals looking for quick power. It was a carefully built operation, one that required planning, money, safe places, and protection. When Traoré's security forces cracked the plot open, the pieces led somewhere unexpected, not just inside Burkina Faso, but across the border, deep into the heart of Ivory Coast. At first, investigators thought the plot might be another internal betrayal. Traitors had been found inside the army. Certain officers had started moving their units strangely. Weapons had gone missing. Some senior figures were meeting secretly outside of official hours. But something didn't add up. The scale was too large, the organization too smooth. Someone bigger was helping them. Someone who had the resources to fund secret operations without raising alarms, who could move people and money quietly across borders. It didn't take long for the clues to point directly at Abidjan, the capital of Ivory Coast. Phone records, financial trails, and intercepted communications all showed the same pattern. Orders were not coming from within Burkina Faso. They were being delivered from across the border. Meetings between plotters were held in luxurious hotels in Abidjan, booked under fake business groups. Money was transferred through private banks with close ties to powerful figures in the Ivory Coast government. Even the secure communication devices the plotters used came from suppliers known to work with Ivorian officials. The betrayal went even deeper than money and planning. After the plot was uncovered, the main organizers fled. But instead of disappearing into isolated forests or hiding among insurgents, they walked straight across the border into the Ivory Coast. They didn't run. They didn't hide. They knew they would be safe. Burkina Faso sent urgent demands to the Ivory Coast for their extradition. Names, faces, locations, all provided in official letters. But the answers from Abidjan were slow, cold, and meaningless. They claimed they needed more information. They claimed they would investigate the matter. In reality, they did nothing. And in the streets of Abidjan, the traitors lived openly, attending parties, meeting with businessmen, even entering government buildings through private doors. This was not a case of a few criminals hiding under a government's nose. This was a government that had sheltered them. This was a government that had chosen its side. Ivory Coast had not simply ignored the plot. It had hosted it, supported it, and protected those who carried it out. Intelligence reports confirmed that parts of the assassination plan were coordinated directly from Abidjan. Logistics were organized there. Safe houses were arranged there. Arms deals were discussed there. Some meetings were even recorded in luxury restaurants and business centers owned by families closely tied to President Alassane Ouattara's political circle. The evidence was overwhelming. As the reality became impossible to deny, the shock inside Burkina Faso turned into deep anger. This was not just a betrayal by a neighbor. It was a betrayal by a supposed brother. For decades, West African countries had spoken about unity, solidarity, and building a future free from foreign control. Traoré himself had trusted in this dream. He believed that Africa could stand together if it cut the chains of old colonial rule. But now, standing in the ashes of a broken alliance, he saw the truth. Not every neighbor dreams of freedom. Some neighbors still serve the old masters. The people of Burkina Faso felt the betrayal just as sharply. News spread quickly about how the Ivory Coast had refused to hand over the fugitives. Markets buzzed with anger. University students marched through campuses carrying signs that said, "A neighbor's hand can kill faster than a stranger's sword." In villages, old men spoke bitterly about how the African struggle was always weakened from within, not just by outsiders. Across the country, a new kind of fury was rising. Not just against enemies far away, but against those who lived next door and smiled while sharpening their knives. For Traoré, the lesson was harsh but clear. He was not only fighting insurgency, poverty, or foreign corporations. He was fighting an invisible war, one where betrayal could wear the face of friendship, where enemies could speak his language and share his skin. Ivory Coast's role in the attack proved something dangerous. Africa also opened a new question, a question that would drive the next stage of Burkina Faso's fight. Why? Why would Ivory Coast, a fellow African nation, turn against a leader trying to free his people? Why would they risk everything, their reputation, their standing in Africa, just to strike down Traoré? It was not enough for Burkina Faso to know that Ivory Coast had sheltered the plotters. They needed to understand the deeper reason, why a neighbor, a supposed ally, would risk so much just to bring down President Ibrahim Traoré. As the investigation widened, as intelligence services pulled apart every thread they could find, a darker story came into view. A story that stretched far beyond simple jealousy or political rivalry. A story soaked in old debts, foreign masters, and silent fear. The first and most obvious reason was fear. Fear of the example Traoré was setting for the whole region. In a world where many African leaders still clung tightly to foreign support, fearing what might happen without it, Traoré had walked a different path. He threw out foreign military bases. He nationalized resources. He told Western powers that Burkina Faso would not kneel, no matter the cost. And worst of all, he survived. Every day that Traoré stayed in power was a living insult to those leaders who had sold their countries piece by piece in the name of stability. For Ivory Coast's president Alassane Ouattara, Traoré's existence was a threat, not because Traoré attacked him directly, but because Traoré's example showed the Ivorian people and people across West Africa that it was possible to break the chains. It showed them that a leader didn't have to answer to Paris. It showed them that a country could stand on its own feet without waiting for permission from the old colonial masters. And that idea, more than any bullet or bomb, was dangerous. Ivory Coast's position made this even more sensitive. For years, Ouattara had been seen as one of the last strong allies of France in West Africa. When Mali pushed out the French army, the Ivory Coast welcomed them. When Niger turned its back on French influence, Ivory Coast doubled its security ties with Paris. Every time another African country took a step toward freedom, Ivory Coast pulled itself closer to its former master. This was not just loyalty, it was survival. Ivory Coast's economy depended heavily on French trade deals, French companies, and French security assistance. Its leadership enjoyed international praise because they were reliable partners in a region turning more and more rebellious. To Paris, Ouattara was a good soldier, someone who could be trusted to protect French interests without asking too many questions. But this loyalty came with a price. The more the Ivory Coast served French interests, the more isolated it became from its African neighbors. The people noticed, the youth noticed. Whispers began in the markets, in the universities, even in the army barracks. If Mali can be free, if Burkina Faso can be free, why not us? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Ouattara knew he was sitting on a ticking bomb. The longer Traoré remained alive and successful, the louder those whispers would grow. Until one day, they would not be whispers anymore. There would be shouts in the streets. They would be marches. They would be demands that could not be ignored. Traoré's survival meant Ouattara's downfall would only be a matter of time. That is why the decision was made. Traoré had to go. Not because of personal hate, not because of simple rivalry, but because of the survival of a system built on obedience to old colonial masters and the fear of what Africa could become without them. But there was an even deeper reason, buried even further under the surface. Traoré's rise wasn't just hurting France's position in Africa, it was also breaking the new economic projects Paris was trying to build. Secret deals to keep control of African gold, oil, and military routes. Burkina Faso's decision to keep its gold, to build its banking system, to trade directly with Russia and China. All of it was tearing giant holes in France's long-term strategy for West Africa. And those strategies depended heavily on the Ivory Coast. Abidjan was supposed to be the new center of French power in Africa, a safe capital, an economic gateway, a political stronghold. But if Burkina Faso succeeded, the wave of rebellion would not stop at its borders. It would wash over Ivory Coast too. It would wash away all the investments, all the promises, all the control. To the people pulling the strings in Paris, and to the loyal servants still sitting in power in Abidjan, the logic was simple. Better to kill one man now than lose a whole empire later. This is why the plot was built. This is why money moved quietly through banks in Abidjan. This is why traders were armed and trained and promised safety once their job was done. And this is why, when the plot failed, Ivory Coast threw away every mask of friendship and openly protected the men who had tried to spill Traoré's blood. The betrayal was never about personal hatred. It was about fear. It was about control. It was about protecting the last walls of an old empire, even if it meant stabbing a neighbor in the heart. Now, with the truth uncovered, Burkina Faso and the whole of Africa had a different, much bigger problem to face. Because if a neighbor could turn into a weapon for foreign powers so easily, what did it mean for the future of African freedom? The survival of Traoré had saved Burkina Faso for now, but the survival of Africa's dream would require much, much more. The betrayal by Ivory Coast was not just an attack on Burkina Faso. It was not only an attempt to remove one man from power. It was something far bigger, far more dangerous. It was a direct message to every country in Africa that had started to believe in real freedom. A message that said, no matter how strong your will, no matter how right your cause, betrayal can come not just from outside, but from the hands of your neighbors. Former colonial powers, foreign corporations, and outside militaries. They prepared themselves for those threats. They built alliances. They strengthened armies. They called for economic independence. But few were prepared for the deeper threat, the enemy that smiles across the border, the enemy that speaks the same language, that claims the same history, but answers to a different master when the pressure comes. Ivory Coast's decision to shelter traitors, to protect the men who planned murder, shows a brutal reality. Africa's fight for freedom is not just about fighting outsiders. It is about surviving betrayal from within. When a neighbor chooses to side with old colonial powers instead of standing with their brothers, it poisons everything. Trust between nations, unity between peoples, the very dream of an Africa that could finally control its destiny. This event has shaken West Africa to its core. If a country like Ivory Coast, a country that often spoke the language of Pan-Africanism in public speeches, could so easily turn into a knife pointed at Burkina Faso's back, then no country is safe. The betrayal revealed that there are still leaders in Africa who have tied their survival to serving foreign powers. Leaders who see the success of countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, not as a victory for the continent, but as a threat to their power. Leaders who would rather sabotage their neighbors than risk their people asking dangerous questions about freedom, justice, and real independence. This betrayal also shows how deeply the old colonial system still lives inside Africa, even if the flags have changed. It's not just about having foreign soldiers on African soil. It's about having African leaders who act like foreign soldiers in their land. It's about having governments that say they are free, but whose survival depends on the approval of Paris, Washington, or Brussels. It's about having systems where loyalty to outside masters is rewarded, while loyalty to African sovereignty is punished. The attack on Traoré was a warning shot. It was meant to scare not just him, but every African leader who dares to walk away from the old system. It was meant to show that even if you build your army, even if you control your gold, even if you make your laws, there will always be a neighbor willing to sell you out for a handshake and a bag of silver. But history has its lessons. Every time betrayal has come, every time the chains have been tightened again, Africa has found a way to resist. The generation that watched Thomas Sankara fall, that watched Lumumba be murdered, that watched revolutions crushed under foreign boots, that generation planted seeds that are growing now. And today's Africa, an Africa led by men like Traoré, is not so easy to fool anymore. The betrayal by the Ivory Coast has opened many eyes. It has exposed the invisible networks of control that many preferred not to talk about. It has shown how money, power, and promises are still used to turn brother against brother. But it has also forced a new conversation across the continent, one that is louder, angrier, and more determined than before. People are asking harder questions now. Who controls our neighbors? Who do our presidents truly serve? Burkina Faso's survival through this storm shows that it is possible to resist. But real freedom will require more than surviving one plot. It will require Africa to open its eyes wide, to speak the truth loudly, and to refuse to let betrayal hide behind the mask of friendship ever again. Ivory Coast betrayal is not just a wound for Burkina Faso, it is a wound for Africa. And how Africa chooses to heal or ignore this wound will decide the future of the entire continent. Now that the truth is clear, there can be no going back. There can be no more polite silence, no more pretending that everything is fine for the sake of regional cooperation. Africa must call this betrayal by its real name. Ivory Coast did not just betray Burkina Faso, it betrayed the spirit of Pan-Africanism. It betrayed every African who still believes that we can rise by standing together. If Africa cannot even speak the truth when one of its own is stabbed in the back, then it has already lost the war for its soul. Public condemnation is not enough. Words alone will not heal this wound. There must be real political consequences. The African Union must formally investigate Ivory Coast's role in the plot against Traoré. If the evidence proves, as it already does, that the Ivorian government sheltered and protected the traitors, then sanctions must follow. Not against the Ivorian people, who are innocent in this, but against the politicians and businessmen who turned their country into a weapon for foreign masters. West African organizations must take the lead. Groups like ECOWAS, which so often speak about democracy and stability, must show that they are not blind when it comes to betrayal from within. If ECOWAS can threaten coups with sanctions and isolation, it must do the same when a government actively helps to organize assassination plots against another African leader. Otherwise, the organization loses all credibility and shows that it is nothing more than a tool for whoever holds the biggest checkbook. But beyond official sanctions and investigations, something deeper must happen. The people of Africa, the youth, the workers, the farmers, the students, must understand that the enemy is not just foreign armies or greedy corporations. The enemy also wears African faces. The betrayal by Ivory Coast shows that colonialism is not always about white soldiers landing on beaches anymore. Sometimes colonialism uses African hands to do its dirty work. And if Africans want true freedom, they must be ready to hold those hands accountable. Do you think dirty leaders should be exposed? Let us know in the comments section. Do Ivory Coast leaders care more about self-interest than Africa? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.